there's such a risk aversion that's crept into the planning fraternity, and they've started operating under a model which is unsustainable. And that model is elimination of risk.
You are listening to the Property Developer Podcast, your home for tips, ideas and inspiration to help take your developing to the next level. Now here's your host, Justin Getty.
Hello and welcome to episode 115 of the show. So great to have you with me. Got another fascinating guest coming up for you today as we discuss the many challenges facing property developers trying to find projects that stack up and provide supply to our growing population. So we're going to explore whether property development is dead in Australia. And we'll get to that very shortly. I know you're going to enjoy that conversation. On the project front, we've been trying to finalise our civil works documentation package so that we can go out to tender and finally get the site works underway. The site is proving to be a bit tricky with levels and the need for retaining walls and various pipework. So we're having a few challenges just getting everything ironed out and ready to get out to market. And on my last project, I'm still trying to sell my remaining 3 townhouses. It's proving a bit tricky to achieve the sales prices that we want. And that project is like the never-ending story for me. Anyway, speaking of stories, if you want to get started on your story of becoming a property developer, then my signature online course, the Property Developer Training, is for you. I'll show you how to break down a project, run the numbers, and avoid the traps that trip up so many new developers. It's practical, real-world advice from someone who's been through it all. So if you're ready to take action and make your first project happen, let's get you the skills to do it right. Head over to www.propertydevelopertraining.com and check out everything that's included in the training. Okay, so maybe you're wondering if you're ready to take on a property development project. Well, take the quick quiz at www.propertydevelopertraining.com/quiz and find out where you stand and what to do next. Okay, on to today's guest. Maxwell Shifman is a director of Intrapac Property and a seasoned property developer with over 15 years of experience delivering master plan communities and medium density housing across Australia. With a background in law and engineering, Maxwell combines analytical rigour with on-the-ground development insight. He's a vocal advocate for planning reform and housing affordability, often speaking out about the systemic challenges facing the industry, especially in Victoria. In this conversation, we cover why Victoria's planning system is driving developers away and putting housing supply at risk, the mismatch between government housing targets and the realities of project feasibility, and how cost blowouts and red tape are killing medium density and apartment developments. Keep an ear out for Maxwell comparing how we tax cigarettes versus how we tax housing. Okay, let's get started by finding out what's the one thing that Maxwell can't do without.
Well, I don't know if it's a food. It's probably just coffee. It might as well be infused into my veins at this point.
Have you got like a fancy coffee fetish, or you're just a straight up black kind of guy?
Oh, I need a good espresso, and there's a couple of good places to get it from, but I'm very particular about the coffee. It's got to be dark and strong.
Yeah, very good. So have you got your own machine at home, or you go out to cafes kind of guy?
A bit of both. I've definitely invested in a machine at home because otherwise I'd be going broke from drinking it so much. So there you go. There's a little insight.
Yeah, well, coffee's getting pretty expensive these days. Not as expensive as building houses, but so we'll get to that.
We will.
But great to have you on the show. Today we're going to be discussing a bit of a hot topic for us anyway, whether or not property development is dead in Australia. We'll have a particular focus on Victoria, but there's going to be these issues across the mainland states in various forms. But before we get to that, why don't you give us a bit of a background about yourself and how you got into property development?
Sure. I actually grew up with property development in my veins. My father was a builder. My mum and dad worked together on small developments around Melbourne's Bayside. So that was my entree into building and development and seeing things at, that smaller end of the spectrum. So they would do a couple of townhouses, some small apartment projects, that sort of thing, nothing of major scale. They liked it that way, and it was in some ways a less risky model than some of the stuff that, the larger developers do. But it was a great training ground. I wasn't heavily involved as a kid, but I'd go and dig holes in my school holidays and move bricks and tidy up, and got to see it from scratch. So that was really good. They wanted me to go to university, even though I always wanted to be in development. So I ended up studying law and engineering. Interesting combination. And that sort of led me down the path of a bit of a detour into forensic and safety engineering of all things before I sort of departed and joined Intrapac. And it's been almost 15 years now.
Give us a bit of insight into Intrapac, the kind of projects you do.
Sure. So look, the business has been around for 41 years now. Started off in land development in Victoria. In fact, our very first project was an industrial project in Dandenong, but pivoted into residential, and have mostly done residential ever since. So over time, we've built up a big portfolio in Victoria. It's now expanded into northern New South Wales, into Queensland, the Northern Territory. We've previously done projects in Perth, and we're sort of open to any geography that we think we can add value to. So it's nice to have that variety in what we do. We've also of late, well, I shouldn't say of late now, it's been over a decade, but we've increasingly focused on the sort of townhouse space as well. Not in terms of, small scale, but in terms of how we plan in a more mid-density product into our larger estates. Because it helps us with, generating a greater diversity of product, letting more people into some of the new estates that have different needs from perhaps a traditional detached home. So it's been a real focus for us. Challenging space, because the smaller it gets, the more sort of detail there is in making it happen. But it's, I would say, a far sight easier and more affordable than doing large scale apartments.
I'm just curious, did you ever do any of your own projects at any point along the line, or is it just all a family affair?
Well, I've always partnered with family, but I've done some stuff outside of Intrapac with my parents on the side. Wouldn't do it anymore, because the truth is you spend as much time working on a tiny project as you do on a very large scale one. So the risk reward return for effort's not there on the smaller stuff.
Yeah, I'm keen on hearing your thoughts around that difference between, say, your smaller project types that might be done by smaller developers, little 3-unit or 4-unit sites, for example, or duplexes versus larger scale developments. What do you see as the key differences?
Well,
apart from the zeros in the feasibility.
The zeros make a difference. Look, you need both of those things happening. In fact, you need stuff happening across the spectrum to sort of deal with the challenge that we have at a national level. So, those smaller projects are really geared towards your smaller operators, your people that are still operating out of a home office or out of their ute, and they're building things and very hands-on. Typically they can only handle a couple of projects at a time, but of that sort of smaller scale. But it's a pretty meaningful part of the business, or the industry rather, in terms of supply. At good times, I think it's really hard to make those projects work when the market's flat or slightly negative. The thing about a larger scale project is obviously a lot more risk, a lot more planning, a lot more that goes into it. But the length of time means that you're not subject to a small part of the cycle. You can sort of, ride things out over the long term, as long as you've, not overgeared yourself and not over leveraged.
Can you just give us a sense of the size of these projects you're talking about that Intrapac does in terms of lot sizes or GRPs?
Yeah, look, it's opportunity driven, but I'd say that most of our projects are in the several hundred to several thousand lot space. So everything from a project we'll be launching later in the year in Wangaratta, which is 127 lots, right through to a project we've got outside of Darwin in Lloyd Creek, I should say, and that's 4,200 homes. So quite a large range there, and it's very much about, again, looking at geography, looking at opportunity, and seeing if you can create something that has a point of difference within its particular context. That's really what we're about.
And I think I read somewhere that you'd had some challenges getting your permit or getting support for the Northern Territory project. Is that correct?
Well, I think the lack of support is a universal thing. So every project has its own challenges. In the case of Lloyd Creek, we went through a previous rezoning process back in, well, it ran from 2018, but was concluded in 2020 with a refusal, a 4 point refusal, which I thought was interesting for a project of that scale. But essentially, there were a few things that we needed to work through. So we sort of used that as a time to reset, reevaluate, bit more market research, understand, what some of those barriers were. And probably the biggest one in that particular case was our early proposal was around using groundwater and bores to supply potable water to the community, which is a major challenge in the territory because of some of the groundwater aquifers being depleted. And so since then, there's been a major project announced to create more potable water through the Manton Dam, bring that back online, and a Strauss water treatment plant that runs with it. And that lets us then connect into reticulated water for the whole of the site. So that's the biggest game changer. We've also addressed some of the other concerns people had, because it's a rural context, a rural project is in larger lots. I think there was a very successful scare campaign run against us last time, which was trying to liken it to some of the urban developments happening in the territory, and that's just never been the case. But we've really codified those principles a lot better now in the current proposal.
So what kind of time frame would you generally be looking at with these projects that of a scale that size? I mean, you've already, 3-4 years in, and you haven't got a permit.
Actually a decade in.
A decade in, no permit.
Process. Yeah, I mean, we have to go through so many steps, right? So first we had to get the land identified in a growth plan, which we did around 2015. Then there was an environmental impact statement through the NT-EPA that was approved as well. So there were all these interim steps before you get to the zoning and actual development approval. And so it was that rezoning step that we failed at. Even though the land was identified for growth, it was more a question of when rather than if at that point, that we had to make time for the right when, which we think is now. So, in that particular case, 10 plus year gestation just to get to the point where you can put some shovels in the ground, and it's probably 30 plus years to roll out given the scale. Now that's unusual, but it's not unusual for many of our projects to be a 10 to 15 year investment.
And so does that involve partnering with landowners, or do you acquire the land outright and then just have to sit on it and pay the holding costs?
It's a mix, yeah. So some of our projects will be DMAs. We'll partner with landowners. We'll come in and do the heavy lifting, do the funding, deliver it. I think we've got a real edge in terms of the quality that we deliver and the marketing that we put out there, and that's been demonstrated across many projects over the years. So it ends up being a win-win for everyone, particularly in those larger, longer dated projects. I think it's very hard for landowners to extract the full value in a one-line transaction. So that's why we're happy to share the risk and the upside as long as the landowner is prepared to come on the journey. And that's been a very successful model for us. And I think people have comfort that it's something that we do a lot, that we're obviously well credentialed, well financed, which is really critically important for selecting a development partner.
And I'm curious to hear your view on the challenges that you face as the head of a property developing company, because a lot of people who'll be listening will just be solo operators. They're doing projects where they're the developer, they're the project director. They've brought all these consultants on to help them. They're not necessarily have direct reports that they report to, and managing strategic objectives and all these sort of corporate needs that you play. How do you find that, given that you have had that experience with that sort of smaller operation as well?
Well, it's a really good point, right? Because running a development business is different from being just a property developer. I sort of straddle the two, but you're right. You've got to deal with all the other stuff. You've got to have an overhead and admin and all the risk stuff that comes with it. And, it is about thinking about strategy, where you want to deploy capital, where you want to be involved in terms of geography and project types and things like that. So that's really interesting. there's pros and cons with that. I mean, it means I get to have a very, very high level view across a lot of different jurisdictions or a lot of different housing typologies, a lot of different systems, and understand how they operate, where they work well and where they don't. But it also means I'm not absolutely in the detail like you would be if you were reviewing, every single plan across, a small project or a single large development. So it probably works better for my personality, and it gives me a little bit of time to be a bit more vocal about industry issues as well than perhaps you would be if you were just a sole trader.
I guess that's the perfect segue into how we became connected. We might as well move into that. So you're based in Melbourne. You have developed a bit of a profile in the last, I don't know, let's just say 12 months, being somewhat vocal about the direction and situation that we face in Victoria from a property development front. I can't remember whether you wrote an article in the Age or the Herald Sun, some opinion piece somewhere that got a lot of traction and kind of pushed you into this sort of industry spokesperson kind of role that you've continued to play. So I'm very curious to kind of explore this topic around the difficulties and challenges property developers are facing at all scales, I think, small through to large. So I'm just keen to hear your thoughts. Obviously, you've got a national focus as well, so you can see things happening across different states, which is really helpful. I think things are particularly challenging in Victoria. That's where your main focus has been, just from your opinion pieces. So let's get into that. Why don't you give us a little bit of background for those who may not know how you kind of came to write an opinion piece, and give us that sort of some fundamental pieces of what you're seeing and feeling.
Sure. Well, it's almost a year to the day, actually, that I started getting a lot more vocal. I think for people's background, I was the national president of the UDIA, the Urban Development Institute of Australia. So I had several years as vice president and then as president, where you sort of get to understand more how the system works. And it's pretty depressing once you understand it. I don't think most people get that appreciation. And so I guess having stepped out of that role about 18 months ago, having had that experience, I got a little bit unshackled in the sense that I could just speak a bit more freely. I'm still on the board, by the way, but I'm not the spokesman anymore. There's a new president. But I think that sort of unique combination of having a national business, understanding the national market, having worked in a direct advocacy role at a federal level, plus also having been on the Victorian board, so dealing with departments and ministers and things like that at that level, and starting to see how disconnected the aspiration is from the reality. I think that's probably the thing that got me. And the particular article that triggered me to become very vocal was this thing about, why aren't we building more family-sized apartments? It's like this constant refrain. Oh, we just need more family-sized apartments in inner cities and we'll magically solve housing affordability. And there's a really good reason we don't build many big apartments, because they're really bloody expensive and way too expensive for most families to buy. So what we've seen the last few years, and it's been exacerbated by the cost increases we've experienced after COVID, is development costs have gone up universally. They've gone up much more in the apartment space. And the ability for someone to buy a new apartment is really fraught compared to what they can achieve for a much lesser amount of money in a greenfield or a townhouse context. And so there's this disconnect between the sort of utopian ideal of living in apartments around train stations and families and all that sort of thing versus economics. And it's that bit that I've really honed in on. And particularly when you've got both federal and state governments now really talking about housing targets, and they're going to build all these dwellings. By the way, they don't build anything. The industry builds everything. That disconnect between what they would like to see in an ideal world and what's actually deliverable is the thing that it really bothers me. And at a sort of more micro level, at a business level, I know the arguments I'm having on a daily basis with bureaucracies, with authorities, with councils, with government, that get in the way of actually delivering the thing they say they want delivered. So that's the thing that I'm calling out. And yeah, it sort of led to an article or an op-ed that I put in The Age late last year. There was back in October 23, the housing statement, big sort of, set of ideals the Victorian government was going to put out there. And then 12 months on, nothing had really happened. And all of a sudden there was this week of housing announcements where they're building activity centres and all sorts of things, all these wonderful aspirations. And I just felt compelled to call out why what they're saying they want to do, which if you look at the messaging is put millennials into housing, is not actually going to be achieved because they're focusing on the wrong things. So that just set me down a path. I've written things about cultural heritage and the challenges with that space in The Age, and recently had an op-ed in the Herald Sun about the Suburban Rail Loop, which is a very controversial topic in Victoria as well. So it's been interesting having that profile and that platform. I think most people, when you explain to them, actually appreciate and understand what I'm saying, because I'm just trying to cut through the nonsense. And I have a simple view in terms of the politicians. If they say they're going to do something and they're not doing the things they need to do to get there, then they should be held to account.
Oh, there's so much to explore here. Be careful not to get cancelled from this episode.
I'm feeling a bit cancelled around the place.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm sure you've had a bit of backlash as well as support. That's just what happens when you put your head above the parapet. Do you believe that there is genuine intent or desire from politicians and the bureaucracy to actually deliver on these announcements? Because I think in Victoria, at least, we have a government that's very big on making announcements, not necessarily very big on follow through and execution.
I think it's a very kind way of putting it, Justin, but it's absolutely right. And it's the same at federal level too. The last federal campaign was very much about headlines and targets and big numbers, but very light on the detail of how they're going to achieve it. So, and that's the criticism of all sides. Obviously the election's now happened and Labor's got a strong majority, but all the messaging was the same, even at federal level. If you looked at Labor's campaign, it led with, "We are building 1.2 million homes." Now, everyone in industry knows there's zero chance of that happening, like zero. We'll be lucky to hit 900,000 on the current trajectory. And that's a very, very big shortfall, to put it mildly. And again, the same criticism applies federally, that they haven't really been able to do the things that they need to do to get to the 1.2. And to be fair to a federal government, they don't really control the day-to-day. It's very much state-based. But bringing it back to the state, there is no question that it's very much about the appearance of doing something versus actually doing the thing. And that's really concerning for the younger generation. I think they're being sold this idea that the things the government's doing, because they're talking a lot about this stuff, suddenly means they're going to be solving the problem. And it's a really hard thing to do, because development's really complex, and a person doesn't understand the industry, doesn't understand what goes into it, probably just thinks that developers just put a magic number out there and they just are greedy and want to make too much money, and that's why nothing stacks up. Not understanding that, well, actually we have to deal with market vagaries, regulatory vagaries, increasing requirements, a huge tax and regulatory burden, all the duties, all the holding costs, financing costs. In my case, having to also run a business that survives and can hire people and run an overhead. Like, these are really hard things to do. And at the end of the day, you've got to try and survive and hopefully get to the end and make a buck too. Like, that's a really difficult thing. And unfortunately, I think politicians for the longest time sort of weaponized developers as being those sort of greedy people that, don't deserve respect, when in actual fact, private industry delivers 97% of the housing people see. And the other 3% is basically community housing associations with government support. So government needs industry, but thinks industry is its enemy. And that's a disconnect that isn't going to lead to more housing getting built.
Yeah, I mean, you've got a state government in Victoria, and I know some other states as well, but obviously I have the lived experience here, where essentially they've demonized property investors and property developers over probably close to 10 years, and then put so many weights and drags on the industry through new taxation, new levies, all sorts of these handbrakes that just make it almost impossible to deliver a project to get new stock into the market, whilst at the same time talking about the need to have new stock in the market.
Well, not just new stock, affordable new stock. So, I've quipped before online that we tax tobacco because we want less of it, but we tax housing because we want more of it. I mean, it's a really silly place we find ourselves in. But the taxation burden, the direct and indirect burden for new housing is ridiculous, and ultimately that costs the consumer. And what we see manifest is we continue to deliver less and less housing overall at higher prices. And so because of that tax burden, less stuff is feasible. The only projects that are making sense at the moment are, your sort of higher end projects where you've got people that have good money and are happy to pay a big premium for awesome location, a really high end product. But we've entirely hollowed out that mid-market. And that's where most people are. And so it's all well and good to say we want beautiful apartments that cost $2.5 million each. And I've got no particular problem with that. Do as many of those as people will buy. The opposite, I say build more of it if people will live in it and afford it. But I also know that most Australians, particularly those who are trying to get into the housing market, have nowhere near that sort of borrowing capacity. No matter how good you can say the lifestyle might be living in a city area, if the housing is unaffordable for them, they're not going to buy it. And so what we've done is we've prioritized sort of housing typologies that sound sexy, but are disconnected from the economic realities for most consumers. And that's a real concerning place to be. And I'm worried that there's this perception that we should give up on housing being something people aspire to now in terms of ownership. And it's moving towards, let's just be lifetime renters, through build to rent and other things, which have a role, have a place. But I don't think that's where we want to take Australia either.
Yeah, I think it's really bizarre that there's this big focus on apartments, which is actually probably one of the most expensive housing typologies to build. But you get big numbers from apartments, right? So, on one block you can say, well, there's 50 new homes or there's 100 new homes, versus if it's an infill townhouse project, it might be 3 or 4 on that. So it's an easy way to get the number up in terms of number of dwellings that are being proposed to be built. But it's the most expensive typology to build. And I still don't believe that it's where the majority of people would prefer to live if they could. It's not the fastest typology to build, nor is it the type of building where we have the greatest capacity. Because you have all your smaller builders that can knock over townhouses. You've got smaller developers and investors that can do townhouse projects. I mean, for me, that's really where the biggest opportunity lies. But nobody seems to be wanting to go there.
Well, look, I'll give credit where it's due. The government has come out with some revised townhouse rules as part of their planning amendments, and they are designed to specifically facilitate the sort of stuff you're talking about. There'll be some deemed to comply provisions. They're going to relax some of the setback and other requirements. So on its face, it could actually be a pretty good outcome in that it will unlock a greater amount of that sort of incremental development. And that's been very successful in other parts of the world. So again, I'm not the current policy's number one fan, but I'll give credit where I think it's due, and it is. They are trying to make that space work, but the way they're approaching things, it's still skewed to that being an incremental thing rather than the majority, and they're still pointing to activity centres and apartments around train stations as being the number one goal. So you've got 60 activity centres that have now been identified around Melbourne, on top of the 6 Suburban Rail Loop stations. They're promising all sorts of things. In truth, they're going to be rushing through some pretty half-done plans. They'll probably be putting requirements on the development that make it unfeasible in most of the activity centres. In the end, it'll fall very short of delivering the attainable new supply that we actually need. And it's all well and good to say, someone has to travel further out of a middle ring suburb or out of a greenfield area to the CBD for work. And I get that argument, and I wish people could commute less to where they need to be. But I think that's a very myopic view, because having somewhere to live affordably is probably more important than having people that are homeless on the street but can walk to their office. And that's kind of where we're heading. I know it sounds a bit extreme, but there's no sort of middle ground on this. The way current policy is operating, it's very narrow. So unless you're proposing something that ticks every ideological box around design, around beauty, around quality, around the amount of affordable housing and social housing it delivers, the exact location being perfect in terms of infrastructure and all those sorts of things, it's like computer says no. And there's so much other stuff that could be happening that would be far more impactful in terms of new supply, and particularly new attainable supply. But because it doesn't fit in that ideological box at the moment, it just doesn't proceed. And that's the stuff that I'm battling. And I've got projects which are infill, complex, rehabilitating degraded sites, everything you'd think a government would actually want to facilitate. And I just keep getting roadblock after roadblock. So that's why I speak with a level of authority when I go, what they're saying on the tin is not actually what you're getting.
Yeah, and I see this all the time, like at the very beginning of a project, regardless of the size, whether it's a 3-unit townhouse project or a 1,000-lot land subdivision, as soon as you hit council on the first step, it's almost as though they're the council's position, and this applies across the country. I'm absolutely certain of this because I've spoken to many, many people. It's almost like the council's first position is, how do we knock this back? How do we knock this application back? It's not, okay, how can we facilitate this and work with the developers to get this approval? That's the very first step that you hit.
Yeah, look, I will be fair again that I know there are some councils out there that are less that way. It doesn't mean that when you get down to the detail, they don't come up with all sorts of weird and wacky ways to trip you up, not necessarily deliberately, but there's such a risk aversion that's crept into the planning fraternity, and they've started operating under a model which is unsustainable. And that model is elimination of risk. And it is impossible in every circumstance to eliminate risk. You need to mitigate risk to a reasonable level. I think that's an acceptable measure, but that's not how they think. Any potential risk, whether it's the potential of someone complaining about noise or a rubbish truck not being able to turn a particular way, or the material being slightly different to what they would like to see in an ideal world, or there's geotech stuff that they want, overdone 10 times what it needed to actually be dealing with. There's no downside for a regulator or an authority to just keep asking for more and more and gold plating everything. But all that does is impact the feasibility of the project. And it either does two things. You either don't deliver the project, it's not feasible, or you're delivering it at a price that is more expensive to the end consumer, because they're the ones that pay. And I think that's a real problem. And something you touched on, I want to expand on, which is the way authorities, I hate that word, authorities, but they see it as their role to be the policeman of what you're proposing, rather than the facilitators. I've wanted to write about this for some time, so you'll get the scoop. But the notion that we need to change the name, when the council is the responsible authority, or Vic Roads is the responsible authority, they act as though they can dictate. And there's no alternative but the one that the particular person that you're dealing with happens to have thought of that day, which is probably different if someone else picked up the same file. They need to be responsible facilitators when it comes to housing. You need that mindset shift to change the conversation around development and what it brings to the table.
I can't tell you the number of times I've gone up against planners who want you to use surf mist or monument on the facade.
It's interesting, right?
The thing to surf mist.
Yeah, but it's interesting, right? Those are the things that they think they're adding value on, right? The color of your color bond, it's not, none of this stuff makes a difference. And interestingly, like, they have no regard for the fact that as a developer, as a business, you're the one taking the risk on something working. They have no real skin in the game. They'll disappear. They'll go work in another council. They get promoted or move sideways, whatever. But you have to live with what you've developed. And particularly in the longer dated projects, you're only as good as the last stage you delivered and the last houses that people saw and the park that you created and all those things. So it's in our interest to do really good stuff because it's smart business. It sells. But as you said, like, we get caught up in minutia about whether a setback should be 50 millimeters more off the side boundary or whether the color of that should be a different shade of gray. Stuff that makes no difference. But this is what officers feel like they have to pick up just to prove that they're doing something.
Yeah, they tinker around what is really the margins for a change from where you started to where you finished that really makes no real material difference, but they feel like they've influenced the project and had their
Correct.
say in it.
Yes, and that's what it's about. Look, if you bring it back to a business level, it's really hard sometimes to see something that you would do slightly differently. But there needs to be a better appreciation of what is objectively a problem, i.e., you're significantly over a particular design control around setbacks or around site coverage or whatever the case might be, versus the idea that you have a subjective opinion on how something should appear. Because architecture's in the eye of the beholder, space is in the eye of the beholder, and also people will make choices. And sometimes what we've done is we've taken away the choice from and say, you know what, I've got a budget and I'm happy to work with that. Instead, it's constantly, let's make things better and better, which I get from an ethical perspective. But the consequence is you push more people out of being able to buy something. And I'm not sure whether we've got the balance right.
I remember having a discussion with the director of planning at one of the local councils about a project that I was doing. And we had put forward a proposal for some triple-story townhouses that had some tandem car parking. And they didn't like the tandem car spaces. And I said, just let the market decide. It complies with all the regulations. Like, let us take the market risk. What are you standing in the way of? Just because you don't like tandems, we'll go and talk to the state government and get the regs changed. Because right now you're allowed to do it, but you're saying you don't like it, so you won't support it.
Yeah, again, it's that subjectivity. Or, and again, one of the things that the state government is looking to change, I think it's overdue, is parking minimums. That we, as apartment developers, I'm not one, but I know apartment developers have not been able to make a commercial decision on whether you could sell a 3-bedroom unit with a single car spot and save someone $80,000 on the purchase price. That's not been available. The level of design sort of regulation has meant there's just stymied the ability to be innovative or to create a point of difference in the marketplace. And so what you end up with is a very homogenous product. It all costs the same. It all looks the same. Even something like the B17 res code, where now everything looks like a wedding cake, and you've got to have a slight difference in materiality on the top floor just because we think that's better. And what you've ended up with is stuff that all looks the same. It's all got the same, cladding on the top floor. Whereas, you go back in time, people revere the Art Deco flats from the 40s, 50s, 60s that were all just square boxes, maybe with a bit of a rounded wall. But you couldn't build that under current regs, which is ridiculous. And I often talk about the fact that the best parts of our major cities would never be able to build under the current planning regime. You think about a Paddington in Sydney or a Bondi or Middle Albert Park in Melbourne, right? Tiny blocks, cheek to jowl, no open space, lots of overshadowing. None of that would tick any of the boxes, yet that's where the most expensive real estate in our cities is. And you go, why are you stopping the sort of stuff that adds value? Because you have these preconceived notions of how things should be, which is disconnected from what people will happily accept. So it's funny how much regulation has actually been a negative in terms of design outcomes.
Yeah, well, this so-called housing shortage, which I'm not sure that it is, but anyway, has been coming for a decade or more, with just the resistance that you face as a developer getting through a project from the very beginning through planning, and then pretty much every step of the way, whenever you've got to get endorsements or authorities to sign things off, contribution costs, every step of the way, it's just been a bit of a battle. Do you see light at the end of the tunnel? I mean, building costs have gone up 40 odd %. They've really just put an arrow through the heart of many, many projects.
Mhm.
What do you see on the near horizon?
They say never waste a crisis. I think there will be opportunity in the crisis, in the sense that maybe some of the sacred cows will finally get put on the on the slaughterhouse floor. It's a pretty sort of nasty way of putting it, but it's there's just been all this stuff that has become a bit of a catch cry for urbanists and planners in some of these departments around, or we just can't do something because of whatever particular reason they decided was important for them. And eventually things will get so bad. Unfortunately, I think it has to get to that point. It has to, in the sense that they won't act prior, not because they couldn't act prior. But it has to get to the point where it is just so fundamentally broken they realise they've got to change their ways. Right now, there is still this sort of embedded inability to admit that you're wrong. And that was sort of the topic of my Suburban Rail Loop op-ed, where conceptually it might be a really nice idea till you do the math. And the problem politicians face these days is that they think admitting that they've made a mistake is more fatal than just ploughing on with a particular position because that was the decision they made at the time. And we all pay for that directly through, the cost of projects and our taxes and so forth, but also indirectly in terms of what it does to the broader economy, to confidence, to the ability to buy a house that meets someone's needs at a price they can afford. So these are really, really big issues, and it stems from that political expediency being a greater determinant than getting the right outcome and admitting that you've stuffed something up.
Well, Suburban Rail Loop is an interesting one for those who are listening and maybe don't know. It's basically a circular train line, underground train line that's going to go all the way around through middle Melbourne. Hugely, hugely expensive. And the first section is starting off in the eastern part of Melbourne, which, in my opinion, doesn't need any additional transport, but there's political reasons for going through the east. One of the ideas that the state government is putting forward around Suburban Rail Loop is this concept of value capture, of somehow capturing the value uplift that comes with these new train stations. I think it's pie in the sky, and I actually think the value uplift is what they're aiming for in terms of being able to get more revenue through the door without actually having to build any new dwellings. Because in Victoria, we have what's known as the windfall gains tax, which if there's a change in the zoning and that leads to an uplift in the value, then the government gets, 50% of that value uplift?
Yeah, that's right. So the windfall gains tax is a
sleeping horse, was it? A Trojan horse, in my opinion.
Trojan horse. Well, look, the windfall gains tax is precisely the sort of measure that they're going to use to try and unlock this supposed value. Interestingly, one of the biggest barriers to it actually delivering what it says is it's been excluded from residential homes. So even though you've got these huge catchments, I believe there'll be an exemption for a lot of the properties within it, because a lot of it is just a traditional subdivision pattern that happens to be around a train station. Cheltenham's a great example. You've got a couple of areas, we've got some larger blocks where there might have been old industrial uses, things like that. But predominantly it's, small lot subdivision, traditional 500-600 square metre lots. And I believe they've got an exemption under the rules. So that's going to knock out a huge area of potential windfall. I'm not sure how they're going to get anywhere near the sort of money they're talking about. I mean, just high level, the business case talks about effectively 1/3 being funded by the state government, 1/3 to come from federal government money, which hasn't been promised at this point. They've only got 2 billion roughly promised out of the 12 odd that they need. And then the balance third is meant to come from value capture. And I cannot see how across those six first precincts you could deliver that sort of level of windfall gain tax when you've got those exemptions. And also, just because of development economics right now, the truth is most of these land lots are probably worth more as the current house than they are to a developer once you work out the residual value. So the timing of when they apply this is really important. If they apply in the next 3-4 years when you're suffering from these construction cost constraints and property prices that are being flat, you'll find that the rezoned value is less than the value as an individual house. So that's going to prevent development from happening as well. So all that sort of economics is a little bit fraught, and then you just talk about the fact that it's now being sold as a housing project because housing is now an issue. And if you do the math on the first precincts, $36.7 billion is the price tag. They're claiming 70,000 homes will be unlocked as a result. Well, that's an infrastructure spend of $524,000 per dwelling. So, is that a great investment? And that's on top of the taxes they claim to be charging people. So, the economics just don't make sense.
Well, the state government did say that those activity centres and value capture zones are going to go around tram stops as well, tram and bus stops. And you go, oh, hang on a second. Now you're talking about pretty much all of Melbourne.
Yeah, well, that's right. The tram and train zones, as they're calling them, and these activity centres. So, you'll absolutely have this sort of measure being put out there everywhere. And it's all about sort of bolstering a pretty unhealthy state budget at the moment. There's a state budget coming out. I appreciate there's a lot of non-Victorians listening, but there's going to be a state budget coming out in a week, and I expect it to be quite troubling for the direction of the state.
Yeah, but it applies to other states. I mean, Queensland has looked at all sorts of different ways of putting property taxes in, land taxes. New South Wales has the same issues as Victoria. They're just taking a different approach to it. So there's many challenges facing the property industry to deliver the new properties that are required, particularly when we have a growing population, which the federal government needs to bring in new people to pay taxes. We've got baby boomers that are retiring, so they're going from taxpayers to tax takers, and we need a whole bunch of new citizens or new residents to pay taxes. So we're going to keep having people coming in. We just have to, from an economic point of view, and they have to go somewhere.
Yeah, well, it's a wicked problem, and everything you've said is right, except one of the reasons people wanted to migrate to Australia was for economic opportunity, and part of that economic opportunity was being able to buy a house somewhere near a major city or a regional centre. And so the federal government absolutely wants to have more people come here. We've got skills shortages that we need to fill. We sort of need that underlying growth because we're still a relatively small country in an international sense. But if housing becomes so unattainable for people, that will impact Australia's reputation internationally. And so the assumption that we keep growing at level that the federal government would like us to actually falls away. And it's the same for particular states. You've seen, for example, reports of Sydney being hollowed out in that sort of, middle age group, the sort of millennial age group, in your 30s to 50s, because people who earn a median or higher than median income as a family can't afford to live anywhere in Sydney anymore. So they're moving to the regions, moving to Victoria, which is cheaper at the moment, or other parts of the country. And that's highly concerning for a healthy economy and a healthy society. And so that's a little example of what could start to happen to the country if we continue making housing so expensive to deliver.
See, I actually don't think politicians really care about the value of housing and what it costs, because there's so many things they could do to bring down the cost of housing, but they don't do it.
Well, they don't care about the economics of anything at the moment. As a point
of the cost of a house is fees, charges, taxes, levies, whatever you want to call it, that go into a government coffer.
Yeah. So the justification I hear, particularly for this focus on density and infill, is the cost to government for infrastructure. So they say, well, it costs us more to service new areas. But what they don't want to ever accept is that, let's grant that there is a difference. I actually would refute that, but that gets into a really sort of detailed analysis of, what you include in government infrastructure costs and ongoing management costs. But let's say it's true. Let's say it costs a little bit more for government to service greenfield areas. They never want to account for the extra cost to the consumer, which is anywhere between 2 and 3 times more for a like-for-like dwelling. And you hear arguments about, oh, well, people won't have to commute as long, so they'll save money in petrol or time. That's fine, but they never talk about the fact that if you live in a building of 150 apartments, that your owner's corporation fees will cost you more than the cost of running a car for a year, and you're still living a slightly compromised life because you and your 2 kids only really have access to stuff nearby. If they want to go play footy a couple of suburbs across, you're not necessarily going to have a train or a bus that takes you there because that investment hasn't been made. So there are all these sort of disconnects that are being put out there to sort of justify a particular direction without understanding or wanting to accept all of the economic costs that come into it.
Yeah, I mean, you're looking at projects now, 2-bedroom townhouse projects that I would be doing or have done. You're talking about $650,000 for a 2-bed townhouse on this edge of, metropolitan area. I mean, that's probably more than that now, actually, with rising bill costs.
Well, it would probably be more than that, as you say, but then the equivalent apartment in a new building is probably $850,000, $900,000, and would cost a lot more to maintain to boot, and you'd have less internal space for the equivalent townhouse. And you have to hope that you like the other 300 people you're living with. And again, I sometimes come across too anti-apartment. I'm not. I've done apartments, got friends with apartment developers. I actually really understand the space and the economics. It's just not a place that I wanted to participate in at a scale, because I think economically it's a really troubling space. I much prefer to address that mid-market across our projects. But it's not a utopian thing. And we often point to international experience. They say, oh, we want to be like Paris or like Manhattan or whatever. But you know what happens in Paris? You know what happens in Barcelona? What happens in Manhattan? Families move to the suburbs. And it's the same thing here. Cities predominantly, particularly ones that have grown the sort of way that we have and have the cost base that we have, that's really the key metric here, can't just develop like a Singapore or a Dubai can, where you're importing slave labor from Bangladesh. Like, it just doesn't work that way. They can build whatever they want because it costs them nothing. It costs us 3 to 4 times more for everything that we build. There's a consequence to that that's economic. And that's the bit that the sort of people in charge don't really want to address. Like, all this stuff is good. We want as much infrastructure as possible. We want suburban rail loops. Every great city has a metro, middle ring, and sometimes even an outer ring train system, which is great. But it was probably built in the 1920s when there was no OHS and the unions weren't asking for what they were, and all these other things that have now crept into it that change the math on whether it's the right investment for a city or a country like ours.
Yeah, so in Victoria, that project is sucking huge amounts of money out of the economy and the budget. Doesn't look like going away at the moment, which has helped with increasing costs related to doing other building projects. Not all, I think it would be fair to say, because there's been global changes that have resulted in cost increases that you can't blame on the state government as much as I would like to. So what's the solution there? I mean, from where I sit, prices have to go up by about 20% to start making projects viable without any other costs going up, which never happens. It seems like a while until things balance themselves out. Do you see it that way, or do you have a different view?
I mean, you're right about that sort of feasibility gap at the moment. It is real. I think it varies on the sort of type of housing and the context. So I sort of break it up into three major groups. I think greenfield style housing is probably 10% off where it needs to be in terms of the market before it becomes feasible again. I think your sort of middle ring townhouses probably in that 15 to 20% space. Depending on the project, there'll be cases where it is feasible sooner. And I think the apartment market's close to 30% off where the broader market needs to be before projects become feasible at scale again. And as you say, it's assuming costs don't continue to increase. And even though inflation has moderated in Australia, construction costs are still rising faster than inflation. So they're not going backwards. And for that first sort of post-pandemic period, it was material costs. They were the thing that was really driving everything, but that's now shifted into labour costs. And all those large infrastructure projects, not just in Victoria, other states, you've got the Olympics in Queensland, you've got, major tunnelling projects in the airport in Sydney, you've got big projects kicking off in Adelaide at the moment. So it's happening across the country. But those style of projects and knowing how governments procure things, they want everything, they're happy to throw massive resources at stuff, they just want things done by a particular time to, get a headline, we finish something, rather than focus on sort of best value for money. And what that does do is inflate labour costs overall. And so what we saw was even the most sort of unskilled labour, let's call it, getting really big pay bumps by going from what the private sector was paying at the time into public sector works. And that has maintained and probably accelerated over the last little while. So, we're finishing off a really big project in the Melbourne Metro at the moment. The Westgate tunnel is also being completed. So that's two really big infrastructure projects that have been running for the last sort of, call it 9 years in Melbourne. But they're being replaced by the North East Link, which is of itself bigger than those two projects were. And then you've got the Suburban Rail Loop. So you're only increasing the amount of work, and that's on top of still level crossing removals happening and social housing big build, although that's coming to an end. So all that government work and all that government investment has just decimated the private sector's ability to find workers. And so it's done two things. It's increased the cost of labour very significantly, in many cases virtually doubled it over a short period of time, but it's also killed productivity. So things are taking longer to build. You can't get that sort of sequence happening on site because you haven't got the tradies available. They're too busy. And that's continued even as the number of homes under construction has dropped, and it's dropped quite dramatically the last couple of years. So that just tells you how much those construction projects have mopped up. And I've argued for some time that just putting one of those major infrastructure projects on hold, you'll easily find a job for every single construction worker and then some, just reallocate into other parts of the economy, back more towards the private sector and back more preferably towards housing to start solving that problem. But at the moment, that's falling on deaf ears.
Well, I think what will happen is we're just going to continue to have a shortfall, and then that will slowly start to increase the values due to all the costs and the limited supply, and then it's actually counterproductive because the end result is higher prices for properties.
Correct. Well, as I said, it's delivering less and less at higher prices. That's where we're heading. Sydney's the case in point. I mean, as bad as Victoria is, Sydney's worse by quite a margin. Their construction costs are higher. Their regulation is even worse. They're delivering fewer homes. So when people say it can't get worse, guess what? It can and probably will, because that's the direction we're heading in. And the difference is Sydney has some pretty fundamental physical constraints that prevent it from growing the way that Melbourne can. Melbourne is an artificial constraint that is based on sort of what's called puritanical views of how everyone should live, decided by 22-year-olds who work in Spring Street and ride their bike from Brunswick. But that's, a bit facetious, but it's kind of that. It's live like I say, not.
But they're living in terrace houses.
Well, I think they live in one-bedroom apartments with a bike rack, and that's how everyone should live. Yeah.
I still think councils are going to find a way to stymie some of these changes that are brought in. That's kind of my view from the first step. They're going to find loopholes and still find ways to make it difficult to get permits, is my feeling.
I'm sure they will. I mean, they're talking about deemed to comply, and I'm a fan of getting councils out of the system. By the way, like I would much prefer to have either regional or state level planning when it comes to at least larger projects, because councils often aren't sort of geared up to deal with the complexities and the competing regulatory requirements they have to deal with. So I'm a fan of what they're trying to do in principle, but as you say, they'll find ways of stopping things. And look, basically deemed to comply just means you can't object to something if it's within certain parameters. There'll still be stuff that's outside the deemed to comply, so people will still be able to object. People will still be able to go to VCAT. I don't think it'll save as much time as what they claim across most projects, and nor do I think it'll make any material difference towards the end price of a dwelling.
Yeah, I mean, I had a colleague who had a site in Melbourne who used one of the off-the-shelf apartment block.
I think I wrote about that one.
Yeah, so I know the guy who did that, and council still knocked it back.
Correct. And there's always a good justification, right? There's always a great justification. They're always really good saying, "Oh, we know, but." There's always the way policy.
It's ludicrous. There's an absolutely ludicrous situation where you can have a state government endorsed design plonked on a site where it's supposed to go, and a council still knocks it back. Talk about giving the finger to the state government.
Yeah, and they will find their ways. But I was sort of going to talk about the way policy works. So you have all these policies, local, state, federal. You've got to try and navigate a narrow path through them. And if someone wants to trip you up on anything, they can always pick the policy that they decide you don't need. And so many of them are competing. Like, just look at a planning scheme in Victoria, and you have objectives around housing supply, around diversity, around affordability. Then you also have objectives around retaining trees and amenity, and neighbourhood character's been in there. So anyone can pick anything at a given point to find a reason to say no. And because they're authorities, because they're the police, they like to find that thing to trip you up. It's like the game. That's got to change.
Yeah, I got done on neighbourhood character on a project. Everything ticked the box, and then they got us on neighbourhood character, and it's like you can't argue it. There's no way you can argue against it.
Yeah. So again, the state government's looking at removing it in the new zones. So again, neighbourhood character is insidious. I don't like it at all. I think heritage is different. If you've got a heritage area for a good reason, then that's the sort of character measure. But general neighbourhood character in zones that are designed to change is nonsense. We've had examples where we were applying for 9 townhouses on a particular site, just a small little site, and that would have been an average of 240 odd square meters per dwelling, so not exactly super tight, right? And this was a site that was not adjacent to recent development, but we lost at VCAT because they said the neighbourhood character is lots closer to 300 square meters on subdivisions. And this wasn't in the same zone or adjacent to the existing lots. It was across the road. It was just one of those thumbsuck decisions that goes, oh yeah, I just think it should be this. And that's costly. Like, that hurts your feasibility. That means you have to do, dwellings that are slightly more expensive for the balance. It would make zero difference to anyone down the street or to any of the neighbours or anything like that. But it's just this perception that you have to intervene and make a point.
Yes, I could tell you many stories about situations like that, including myself involved in them. But let's switch gears a little bit now. I just want to ask you a couple more questions. Just, what's one of the more difficult situations or projects that you've had to deal with, and what did you learn from it? What did you have to do to get through?
Well, I think some of those situations are still continuing. So I'd say the most challenging project we've taken on is the redevelopment of the former Lilydale quarry project that we call Kinley. That's a 3,200 lot development, involved the rezoning and rehabilitation of a former limestone quarry. So we're filling a 120 metre deep hole with clean fill and making sure it's geotechnically stable, and eventually we'll develop it. So I wouldn't point to a single thing. It's more just that sort of degree of complexity that we've taken on. So to deal with, a zoning regime, an earth resources management regime, because even though it was a former quarry, it was still being rehabilitated under a work plan. You've got adjacencies with a train line that runs through the middle of the site. So that adds a whole level of complexity around dealing with metro and big track and state government. We've got a TAFE on one of our boundaries that we're trying to work with as well. So the sheer number of people you have to satisfy to get anything happening. Oh, heritage, forgot to mention heritage. They're really good. And so just trying to satisfy everyone.
Those rocks are very special, Maxwell.
Yes. So everyone's got their little silo you have to worry about. No one's got that sort of bigger picture of, hey, we're trying to build housing in a housing crisis. Can we get on with this? And so what we've faced, unfortunately, for the longest time since the zoning is just so much finger pointing. Everyone's responsible for something else, or they think of something else they didn't think of before. And it's meant that we've ended up with a very elongated planning pathway to get the first dwellings built under the rezoned areas. There's a portion that we built a couple of years ago that was already zoned and permitted, and we've finished that years ago. And we've had this nearly 3-year hiatus on planning just because there are so many chefs. And I've been advocating for a long time that these complex, state-significant projects need to have a single source of facilitation with authority. So we were part of sort of a BPA process to get the zoning done. But then once the zoning was approved, that was sort of the end of their remit and they couldn't help us anymore. And we've had to sort of struggle through all these other authorities and decision makers to build housing in an area which is massively undersupplied and crying out. So if we're struggling there on a project of that scale, that significance, that importance to the local area, and with how much it offers in terms of infrastructure investment in and outside of the sites, public open space and amenities, imagine what the small guy's trying to get through, right? No one can get an answer on anything. And it's a little microcosm of what we're experiencing.
Oh, I know it well. It's just down the road from where I've done a few projects.
There you go. Well, I'm sure you've gone through and seen the first stages of Hull Road.
I have.
I think it's going to be an amazing project. I mean, it is already just that little bit that we've done, but it's sad that we're so far behind where we wanted to be. And as we were saying before, all it'll mean, unfortunately, for all this messing around, which will make not an iota of difference to the end outcome, everyone's going to have to pay more now for their lot and their house. And that's, it's a lamentable thing. It didn't have to be this way.
This is going back to an earlier comment that I made, but nobody cares in government.
It's not their problem.
Nobody along that line cares one little bit about that, about the increasing cost to the end consumer. They do not care at all.
Absolutely not.
No. What would you say is the best piece of advice you've received in your property development career, and how has it influenced your decisions?
It's hard to point to a single thing. Rather than focus on the property stuff, more sort of a general business principle that I like to espouse is that for the most part, you got to do the math, as in be commercial and not necessarily take things on for the principle. Because sometimes you might be technical, think you're technically right on something, but once you do the math of what it's going to do to distract you or to take your eye off the ball in terms of the things that really matter, it's often not worth having the fight. Now that's a double-edged sword. So when it comes to really important internal relationships or partners, you always want to find a resolution that avoids lawyers, and that's something that we're very good at. We always find a way of finding mutual benefit. But I also think that it's a slight negative from an industry point of view, because we're all commercial as developers. We don't want to have the fight. We go, well, the fight's not worth the time delay and the cost of fighting, even though we're right. But what that's meant is collectively, we're now suffering from too many authorities over the years just getting away with stuff they should never have pushed and foisted back onto us. And so that's where our industry bodies need to be more vocal, advocate stronger against this sort of thing collectively. But it also means you probably need a few more people like me calling the behaviour out.
Very good. And then what about for developers who might be looking to scale their business? What advice would you have for them to help them ensure long-term success? It's a really tough business these days. I think it's
gotten a lot tougher probably the last decade than what it was previously. And what I've perceived is that there's sort of a bifurcation in the development sector. You're either really small, you are the guy who's doing 3 or 4 townhouses out of, the back room, or you're a developer of my scale or thereabouts, because trying to sort of be in the middle's just become too hard. Doing 30 lot subdivision is as hard as doing 300 or 3,000. So you've either got to be really lean or really well geared up and capitalized. So I guess the message there is, don't gear up too quickly if you haven't got the capital to sort of run through a cycle. That's where people get caught out.
Yeah, well, it's been on display in the last couple of years when costs have shot up. It's really
correct.
hurt a lot
I
of
don't
people
think we're
across the
through that,
industry.
unfortunately.
No, well, there's still people falling over,
Yeah, absolutely.
which actually makes it harder to deliver on housing when you got less builders.
Of course, yeah. I mean, the capacity has been reduced significantly. Builders have just gotten out because it's too hard. They don't want to deal with the regulation. We haven't even talked about, some of the mooted consumer changes, like changes to developer bonding, and they're going to revamp the entire homeowners warranty insurance regime, because all this is going to add costs and push people out. People that probably have been in the industry for 25 years and just don't want to deal with the headache anymore, the ongoing liability and risk. It's really concerning.
Well, they will just continue to demonize developers, Maxwell, because governments will just turn around and blame developers for not delivering the stock. They'll say whatever reason it is, it's their fault. They want too
absolutely.
much money, they want too much margin, they want too much profit, they don't want regulations, they don't want insurance, they don't want to be accountable, they don't want to be responsible, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, there's no appreciation for risk, and that increasing risk makes things cost more, not less. But they're trying to sort of reallocate all the risk back onto the private sector and the developers and the builders. And yeah, that's going to scare a lot of people, and I think rightfully so. So yeah, again, you'll end up with better quality, using quotation marks for those who are listening, but you'll end up with a lot less of it overall. And that's the continued trajectory we seem to be barreling down. So yeah, it is a major concern, and that capacity is being eroded from the system every day.
I'm quite keen to hear your thoughts on building relationships. You've said you've got a well-resourced organization. What's your key to success in terms of dealing with investors and stakeholders?
Yeah, look, when it comes to investors, I mean, I was fortunate. I came into a business that had some really strong relationships to begin with. But I think the core of that has always been that the way we structure our deals, we're incentivized to make the real estate work and not just sort of clip the ticket, which is how some people do it. And that alignment of interest is really important. So that's really critical for us. And you've got to treat your investors' money like your own, in fact, with greater priority. So they always get the priority when it comes to deals. And that's, I think, a fair way of doing things. But those are sort of the principles that we've had at Intrapac in terms of bringing partners in and looking after their money. So that's critical. In terms of external stakeholders, look, it's difficult. Before I became notorious, I used to always try and do the sort of softly, yeah, we'll work with you, we'll try and, resolve things. And it just got to a point where none of that was working anymore. And I think it's a bit like every pendulum, right? I think, there was probably a lot of animosity or adversarial approaches years and years ago. Then it sort of became more facilitative. But I think it's gotten too PC. People are now too afraid to speak their mind. And that's to everyone's collective detriment. And so stakeholders of all kinds should be able to have a difficult conversation with. And I think we've lost the ability to have a difficult or uncomfortable conversation where we disagree on something. It doesn't mean you scream and holler and call people names, far from it, but you can have a strong position, advocate for it, and hopefully get, a group of other people with a similar issue getting behind you as well. But what I've noticed is people are afraid to do that. They're afraid to show a level of disagreement directly to someone or publicly. And we've lost that sort of ability to argue on the merits of a decision or a policy or a direction that's being taken. I think we need to try and get people more comfortable with the idea of, vocalizing reasonable, supportable positions in a way that might disagree with the orthodoxy.
Yeah, well, certainly councils have a tendency to just kick the ball off to the courts or the tribunal to resolve. They'll just refuse it or won't make a decision and then kind of say, oh, let the tribunal decide and we wash our hands of it.
Absolutely. And that's why you might as well take the councils out of the process for particularly more complex stuff. I think anything more than a couple of units should be outside the council regime, frankly.
Yes, I don't see them adding any value whatsoever to planning, but
Nope.
That's just my view. If people want to...
I'll just say on that, I think councils and local communities have a role to play in the big strategic planning side of things. I think they have to have a role in saying, look, there are certain things we would like in our community, and there are certain areas where we'd like to see a level of growth, and it's about creating a hierarchy. I think there's a role for councils to play in that sort of larger strategic space. But I think once they've set those plans, they need to get out of it and let the system be far more accommodating of those that comply with it.
Well, I've seen them introduce those plans and then fight.
Oh, I agree. That's
boxes that comply or align with those plans, and then they just change their decision or they change their view because the winds of change have swung.
Correct. Yeah, that's the absurdity that we need to address. So be involved, but once that plan is set, and you may not agree with everything because you've got, as a council, obligations beyond your existing residents, you do have a requirement to deal with future growth as well to an extent. I think the state should set those targets. So I'm not against housing targets like they've set them at state level, but I think the local communities can be more involved in setting where that should go and what form. And then once that's been set, you've got to let the private sector actually deliver it without that sort of extra level of interference.
No, those targets are meaningless, Maxwell. You and
Well, they are. I agree. They're unconceivably difficult to reach.
Anyway, been great talking with you. I'm always loving talking about property development and the challenges that we face and just the industry. I always find it fun and enjoyable. But if people want to find out more about you or about Intrapac, where should they head?
Well, LinkedIn's my platform of choice. So please follow me on LinkedIn, Maxwell Shifman, or look us up on the web. Just keep listening and support. And I would say to people, I get an inordinate amount of private support for what I'm doing, but we need more people to stick their head above the parapet.
Yeah, I was just about to encourage people to be more vocal and publicly getting their views across around development and supporting development, because that's the only way things get changed, because otherwise politicians just think some small interest group is speaking for everybody and they make decisions based on that, which often the case isn't the reality.
Absolutely.
All right. Awesome talking with you, Maxwell. Thank you so much for being a guest on the Property Developer Podcast. I've really enjoyed speaking with you.
Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to the Property Developer Podcast. Tune in next time for more tips, ideas and inspiration to take your developing to the next level. For more developing love, make sure to visit propertydeveloperpodcast.com.